I froze when I saw my wife kissing a strange man, so I said, "Be happy, I've already filed for divorce," and even though I said it firmly, something inside me crumbled. I walked out of there without looking back, taking the pain and dignity with me. She tried to justify it later, but the choice had already been made. And the most absurd thing is that, no matter how much I had rehearsed 1,000 times how I would react if I ever discovered an infidelity, the truth is that there's no preparation possible. No mental simulation prepares you for the sharp cut of reality. Nothing teaches you how to lose someone you trusted blindly, with whom you built plans, lives, bonds, stories. It's like the ground is being ripped out of you, but without warning. As if the air was drained from you, and no one around you noticed that you were drowning in silence. And the most ironic thing of all is that, when I saw them both there, in front of me, I didn't feel anger. I felt pity. Pity for myself, for having loved so much someone who, clearly, hadn't loved me for a long time. And pity her, for having become the kind of person who destroys what is rare for a passing whim. The betrayal wasn't just a kiss. It was a history of small omissions, deleted messages, unexplained mood swings. It was that coldness disguised as fatigue, that distance disguised as routine. And I accepted it all silently, pretending not to see, because those who truly love prefer to doubt their own intuition rather than face the truth. Until the truth ripped through my chest without asking permission. I saw it. With my own eyes. And even then, my first impulse was to maintain my composure, to guard my dignity like someone clinging to the last shred of self. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I simply told her to be happy. That everything was settled. That the divorce was on the way. And I left. But anyone who sees a man leave the scene silently can't imagine the turmoil that remains inside him. The following days were a blur. Sleeping was a war, waking was a defeat. Memories invaded like ghosts, the details of her face haunted me in every corner of the house. The toothbrush still in the bathroom. The blouse forgotten on the couch. The songs that hurt now. The scents that still lingered on the pillow. And the dreams, oh, the dreams took a while to accept that she wouldn't come back. Because part of me, even hurt, expected her to regret it, to knock on the door, to say it was a mistake. But she didn't show up. And that hurt more than the betrayal itself. It hurt to realize I was easy to leave, that everything we'd been through wasn't strong enough for her to fight for us. Over time, the roles reversed. When I finally managed to get back on my feet, when I'd already accepted there was no going back, it was she who returned. She arrived with her eyes downcast, her voice trembling, saying she wanted to talk. That she missed me. That she didn't know what had gotten into her. That she'd made a mistake, but that she still loved me. I just listened. Because listening, unlike forgiving, doesn't hurt. I listened like someone listening to the rain tapping on the window in the early morning, unhurriedly, without interruption, without taking my heart in. When she finished, she looked at me, waiting for something. Anything. A sign. An answer. And all I could say was, now I'm the one who doesn't want it anymore. She cried. She tried to hold my hand. She said she was sorry. That the other person meant nothing. That she was confused, needy, weak. That she lost herself. But the truth is, those who betray don't lose themselves, they reveal themselves. I saw in her eyes the desperation of someone who understood too late the value of what they lost. But I felt no pleasure in it. There was no revenge in my tone. There was only the relief of someone who survived the cruelest pain, being betrayed by the one who swore eternal love. And she thought she could rebuild everything with regret, as if love were a piece of furniture that fits together again after breaking. But it isn't. Broken love doesn't come back together. It can be glued back together, but it will never be the same. And she discovered this in the most painful way possible, alone. Not because I wanted it. But because that's what was left. Her lover disappeared from her life as he had entered, without commitment, without roots, without consequences. And she was left with the void he created. She tried to return to our circle of friends, but was met with cold looks, short hugs, conversations that stopped when she arrived. She realized then that she hadn't just betrayed her husband, she had betrayed the trust of everyone who believed in the story we'd built together. She was banished without words, forgotten without revenge. And there is no greater pain than feeling invisible among those who once loved you. Meanwhile, I carried on. Little by little, I rebuilt who I was before her. I started going out, smiling again, allowing myself new encounters, new exchanges. I discovered a peace I hadn't felt in years. A lightness that only comes when the wound heals slowly, but with truth. And then, when I least expected it, someone appeared. Someone who didn't hide their phone, who wasn't afraid to love transparently, who looked at me with admiration, not boredom. With her, I learned that love doesn't have to be painful to be real. That affection doesn't need to be begged for. That respect isn't a favor, it's a foundation. And yet, the shadow of the past still visited me in some silences. Sometimes, I saw her from afar, walking alone, with the same empty look of someone searching for something they no longer know where to find. Sometimes, our eyes met by chance, and there was an apology contained there, silent, urgent. And I forgave. Not for her, but for myself. I forgave so as not to carry the poison of resentment, to leave the past where it belonged. But we never returned. Each went our own way, she with the regret and weight of having destroyed a true love, I with the serenity of starting over. What she didn't know was that, deep down, there was one last thing still waiting for her, a truth she hadn't yet discovered, and that would change everything she thought she knew about the pain she'd caused. A revelation that would come too late. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support cheating, in any form. All the stories told are fiction, but they carry a truth. Betrayal destroys, marks and changes lives forever. Our purpose is clear, to show, through emotion and drama, how wrong choices can separate us from true love, forever. Get ready. What you're about to hear is intense, painful and unforgettable. Press play. The story begins. Gabriel and Laura met in a small cafe, one of those almost hidden between two busy avenues, where the city's rush doesn't reach. It was a Saturday afternoon, when he was absent-mindedly reading a worn-cover book, and she entered with a curious look, as if unsure whether she was looking for coffee or some silence. Her eyes met his by accident, but it was her smile, shy, almost embarrassed, that caught his attention. They began with a polite, "Good morning," then a comment about the weather, and before they knew it, they were talking as if they'd known each other for years. It wasn't one of those explosive encounters where everything immediately catches fire. It was more like a constant breeze, light but impossible to ignore. Laura had a calmness that contrasted with Gabriel's restlessness. He was rational, methodical, practical, the kind who makes lists even for vacations. She was fluid, impulsive, and passionate about small details, like watching leaves fall in autumn or the reflection of light on a car window. This difference, far from driving them apart, brought them even closer together. For the first few months, they experienced what many would call the ideal beginning. Sunday lunches at his mother's house, long walks in the late afternoons, notes left on the fridge, short trips just to escape the routine, and an intimate connection that grew day by day. There was trust, admiration, and even a kind of subtle devotion, as if they both understood, albeit subconsciously, that they had found something rare. Gabriel would often watch her sleep, and even on the difficult days, and they came, as in any real relationship, he believed that, in the end, they would be okay, because there was a silent solidity between them. Laura, on the other hand, felt in him a safe haven, a stability she'd never known before. She came from a history of broken relationships, of promises made and broken, of people who didn't know how to stay. And it was Gabriel's constancy that made her surrender deeply. She said he was her calm, and he believed she was the necessary chaos that gave color to his otherwise gray life. Time passed, and they decided to live together in a modest but characterful apartment. The walls were adorned with paintings they bought together at street fairs, the shelves were filled with their books, and every corner held a reminder of a shared moment. It wasn't a perfect house, but it was a home. At first, they adapted easily. Gabriel took care of the bills, Laura took care of the decorations, he made the coffee, she washed the dishes, and each small routine was a silent pact of mutual care. Over time, naturally, deeper differences emerged. Gabriel liked silence upon waking, Laura was talkative from the first minutes of the day. She left her clothes scattered, he arranged everything in a straight line. Sometimes they fought, sometimes they laughed about their arguments, and sometimes they just looked at each other in silence until one of them gave in. But even through their disagreements, there was something intact between them, the desire to continue. To make it work. To choose each other, even on bad days. Gabriel worked as a financial analyst, a demanding position that kept him locked in front of screens, numbers, and cold decisions for hours. He left early, returned late, and often brought the stress of work home, even unintentionally. Laura, meanwhile, was a literature professor and lived in a parallel world of books, poetry, and restless students. Her days were filled with stories, metaphors, and emotions, which made her naturally more sensitive to changes around her. She noticed nuances in tone, longer silences, subtle distances. Gabriel, focused on the concrete, didn't always notice when something in her changed. Sometimes, she had to say bluntly that she was tired, that she felt alone, that she wanted more presence, not physical, but emotional. He listened, tried to improve, but wasn't always successful. And yet, she was still there, believing in the love they'd built. Because for Laura, love wasn't just about the good times, but about the daily choice to stay. Weekends became the most precious moments for them both. That's when they were able to reconnect, in suits. They went to the movies, cooked together, visited their parents, or simply spent the day at home, each doing their own thing, but with the certainty of the other's company. Laura said the best place in the world was the living room sofa, lying on his chest, listening to his heartbeat while the TV talked to itself. And Gabriel smiled, because he felt it too. They had mutual friends, frequent dinners, short trips on long weekends, and everything indicated they were heading toward a solid future, perhaps marriage, perhaps children. They talked about it sometimes, with a mixture of fear and excitement. His family adored Laura, seeing in her a light that lit Gabriel's hardest side. And her family, initially wary because of her history of disappointments, eventually surrendered to the visible affection between them. They were seen as the balanced couple, the ones who respected each other, who understood each other without much fuss. Those who seemed to have found something that many had been searching for their entire lives. But it's curious how the cracks always start small. First, there was the change in their gaze. Then came the shorter responses, the rarer touches, the kisses given out of obligation. Gabriel didn't know when, but he sensed something was off. He tried to compensate with gifts, surprises, attempts to reclaim what they were missing, without knowing exactly what. Laura, for her part, seemed distant, sometimes nostalgic, sometimes irritated for no apparent reason. She said it was just fatigue, that the days were busy, that she needed space. And he, respectfully, gave it to her. Because love also meant knowing how to give space. But there was a gap growing between them, and Gabriel no longer knew how to fill it. The conversations, once so long, became monosyllables. Texts throughout the day diminished. Spontaneous smiles became rare. Still, every night they slept in the same bed, exchanged goodnights, and shared the same roof, like two bodies that learned to coexist even when their souls were already drifting apart. Despite the subtle changes, Gabriel never doubted her love. I was convinced, or perhaps hoped, that they were just going through a phase, something any couple would face after years together. He trusted her with the innocence of someone who never considered the possibility of being deceived. He believed the love they'd built was strong enough to weather any storm. There was no jealousy, no mistrust, only the certainty that they were together by choice, not obligation. He didn't see the signs. Or I did, but I chose to interpret them with optimism. And that said much more about him than it did about her. Laura, on the other hand, was waging an internal war. There was a growing restlessness within her, a feeling of absence she couldn't name. It wasn't an absence of love, but perhaps of herself. She was beginning to question everything, the life she'd led, what she'd left behind, the paths she hadn't taken. Gabriel was everything she had ever said she wanted, and at the same time, something in her was crying out for something different, for something that she didn't even know what it was. The routine continued. The days piled on top of each other like pages in a book that seemed to repeat the same chapter. Work, dinners with friends, visits with family, late afternoon coffees, trips to the supermarket, everything happened as if nothing were wrong. But inside, Laura was beginning to fragment. And Gabriel, stuck in the routine, trying to keep everything going, didn't realize that the love he cherished so dearly no longer held the same place in both of them. They still smiled in photos, still exchanged gifts on holidays, still talked about the future as if it were certain. But what sustained it was no longer passion, not even intimacy, it was habit. It was the fear of starting over, the fear of hurting, the fear of admitting that they might not be the same anymore. And yet, they continued. Because loving, sometimes, is also about persisting. Even when everything inside you already knows it's about to end. But until that moment, no one said anything. And that's exactly where everything starts to change. Gabriel began waking up with a feeling he couldn't name. A vague but constant unease, as if some piece of the day was always out of place. Laura still slept beside him every morning, but the way she turned away, even on cold days, made him realize something had changed. Not suddenly, but like a silent erosion that eats away at the edges of trust until it transforms the landscape. The good morning kiss became a gentle wave with half-closed eyes. Breakfasts, once full of conversation, became comfortable silences for only one of them. Gabriel tried not to interpret these changes as definitive signs, he preferred to think it was fatigue, or distraction, or any other reason that didn't involve the feeling he still believed was intact. But there was something in the air. And that something began to accompany him on car rides, in the hallways at work, at Sunday dinners with his family, as if a cloud hovered over his head, threatening rain at any moment. Laura, for her part, seemed more alive than before. There was a new sparkle in her eyes, something he hadn't seen in months. But it wasn't a sparkle aimed at him. It was as if her inner world had been turned on in a different direction. She started dressing up more, going out more often, coming back later, always with simple, seemingly harmless excuses. Gabriel, rational as he was, didn't give in to paranoia. But his intuition screamed softly, enough to disturb his nights and lengthen the hours she wasn't home. He began noticing the clothes she chose, the different perfumes, the silent notifications on her phone. Sometimes, he even went to the bathroom just to check if she had open messages, but he always stopped before touching the device, as if still wanting to protect the illusion that everything was okay. One day, she came in laughing, her phone still lit in her hand, and when he asked what was so funny, she simply replied that it was a meme sent by a friend from college. He smiled, but inside, a wound was beginning to open. The distance between them worsened when Gabriel suggested a trip for two to try to reconnect with what was being lost. Laura refused without much thought, saying she couldn't take time off from school, that deadlines were tight, and that maybe during her next break. And although it was a plausible excuse, her tone lacked enthusiasm. He didn't insist, but frustration built up along with other small, everyday disappointments. One Friday night, he prepared a special dinner, something she always said she missed. He cooked her favorite dish, put on some light music, lit candles, just like the times when surprising her was his greatest pleasure. But when she arrived, visibly tired and rushed, she barely noticed the effort. She gave him a quick kiss on the forehead, said she wasn't hungry, and went straight to the shower. Gabriel sat at the table, alone, staring at the cooling food and the glass of wine he'd poured for them both. That night didn't end in a fight or an argument. It ended in silence. And perhaps that was the greatest pain. In the following days, their conversations were limited to functional phrases. She always seemed busy, as if there was an invisible rush in everything she did. She began spending more time away, citing extra meetings, school events, and get-togethers with old friends. He tried not to intrude, respecting her space, but his heart wouldn't leave him alone. He began noticing small details, the way she looked in the mirror before leaving, the smiles she gave while looking at her phone, the way she avoided letting him take her phone even for a simple photo. The once solid trust was now slowly crumbling, and as much as Gabriel tried to cling to their past, to what they had built, there was a part of him that was beginning to accept that perhaps love was slipping through his fingers. In a final attempt to salvage something, he suggested couples therapy. She declined, saying she didn't want to turn their relationship into a project to be fixed, that she needed to think alone, breathe alone, understand what she felt. And he respected her. Once again. But each refusal was like another brick in the wall she was building between them. Until Saturday came. A seemingly ordinary Saturday, with no definite plans. Laura said she was going out to lunch with a friend she hadn't seen in a while. Gabriel, without any arguments, simply nodded. He spent the day trying to distract himself with random tasks, but something in his entire body told him that this day was unusual. He couldn't concentrate on anything, his eyes kept returning to the clock, his cell phone remained silent, and her absence felt heavier than ever. Late in the afternoon, he went for a walk. He wanted to clear his mind, think about other things. The sky was already beginning to change colors, and he was wandering aimlessly when he passed the street where the same cafe where they'd met was located. On impulse, he decided to go in. The place was crowded, but still familiar. He ordered a coffee, sat by the window, and let his eyes wander over the people around him. And that was when he saw it. Across the street, right in front of the cafe, she was. Laura. Laughing. With her hair down, the dress he always complimented, and a sparkle in her eyes he hadn't seen in a long time. Beside her, a man. Tall, unfamiliar, with his hand resting intimately, possessively on her waist. Gabriel couldn't process it immediately. It took seconds, maybe minutes, to accept that it wasn't a mistake, not a coincidence. It was her. It was real. When they both turned, he saw it. The kiss. Long, enveloping, filled with a passion she hadn't shown him in a long time. That scene pierced him like a blade. He felt no anger, no hatred. He felt only a devastating emptiness, as if the world around him had stopped spinning. He stood up and crossed the street with firm steps, without hesitation. When he got close, she saw him. Her smile faded, her entire body froze. Gabriel looked into her eyes and, in a calm voice, simply said, "Be happy. I've already filed for divorce." She opened her mouth, tried to say something, but he didn't give her time. He turned and left. He didn't run. He walked calmly, like someone carrying the weight of the end on their shoulders, but also the dignity of someone who chose not to beg for someone who no longer chose them. That night, the house seemed even emptier than usual. Gabriel entered, turned on the lights, and examined every detail that bore her face, the picture frame, the book on the table, the slipper in the corner of the living room. He sat on the sofa, and for a moment, he allowed himself to feel. The pain came in waves, deep, as if each memory screamed inside him. But he didn't break anything, didn't scream, didn't cry out loud. He just took a deep breath. For the first time in a long time, he breathed on his own. He knew that a story ended there. And even without yet knowing everything behind that scene, the whys, the details, the lies, he understood that the decision had been made. She tried to justify it later. She called. She texted. You said you needed to explain. That it was more complicated than it seemed. That it wasn't really like that. But Gabriel wouldn't listen. Not at that moment. Because there was a kind of pain that isn't healed by explanations, only by silence and time. And in that silence, something inside him was beginning to shift. He still didn't know everything. He still didn't know the whole truth. But he was about to discover that the betrayal was just the surface of a much deeper abyss. And what was about to emerge from that abyss would change everything forever. Laura appeared late in the afternoon, 3 days later. She knocked on the door slowly, without insistence, as if she no longer expected to be received. Gabriel heard the sound, hesitated, but finally opened it. She was there, her eyes downcast and her shoulders hunched, so different from the haughty woman he'd seen on the sidewalk days before. She carried in her hands an old coat she'd left behind, but her look revealed it wasn't the coat that had truly brought her back. He let her in without a word, walked to the living room, and sat on the sofa. She followed him, her steps hesitant, and for a moment they were both silent, as if the weight of what had been left unsaid was present in every inch of that space. Gabriel didn't ask anything, didn't demand, didn't accuse. He was willing to listen, but not to save. And Laura knew it. That's why she took a deep breath, like someone preparing to jump off a cliff, and began to speak, not with excuses, but with memories, with lapses of sincerity that had never been shared. She said she'd felt disconnected from herself for months, that something inside her had begun to scream for something she couldn't even fathom. She tried to ignore it, clinging to routines, to good memories, but a part of her no longer saw itself within the life they'd built. Gabriel listened without interrupting, his expression hard and weary, as if he'd waited too long for those words. Laura spoke of the emptiness, the doubts, the fear of having lost herself in the name of a relationship that was too stable, too predictable, too good for someone carrying so much unresolved emotional baggage. She didn't try to justify herself. She said she'd made a mistake, that she could have asked for help, that she could have been honest before searching elsewhere for what she lacked within. She apologized. Not for the betrayal itself, but for lying, for walking away in silence, for leaving Gabriel trying to fix something she already knew, deep down, she no longer wanted to keep. And then, he took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and said he knew. That I didn't need to hear the details anymore. But it was at that moment that she said the thing that changed everything. They didn't take me back. Gabriel frowned in confusion. Who? She hesitated, and then, her voice breaking, added, our friends. All of them. I tried to come back, tried to pretend nothing had happened. But no one looked at me the same way. My invitations went unanswered, conversations stopped when I arrived, hugs were short and forced. I was excluded. By everyone. Even my best friend. She told me I betrayed her trust too, by hiding what was happening. He took a while to respond. The silence seemed heavier than any words. Gabriel then stood, walked to the window, crossed his arms, and stared out. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but firm. He said he hadn't asked anyone to judge her, but he also couldn't control the impact of her choices. He said he never told anyone the details, that he didn't seek emotional support from any mutual friends. He just moved on with his life. Laura shook her head, tears in her eyes, and added, you didn't need to. They knew. They saw you after that. They saw what you became. A man silent, but with his dignity intact. They took sides without you having to say a word. Gabriel continued with his back to her, listening. She then said that, for the first time in her life, she understood what it was like to lose everything at once. Not just him. But her history, her surroundings, her roots. She said the man she'd been with hadn't even responded to her last messages. Who left her without saying anything, who never promised anything, and who, foolishly, believed that there was a new beginning there. Gabriel turned, looked at her with a mixture of compassion and coldness, and said he understood. That he, too, once believed in illusions. That he, too, thought love was a given. But now he knew that true love only exists when there's truth on both sides. Laura wept, not with despair, but with resignation. She was exhausted, tired, defenseless. And then, in an even lower voice, he revealed what Gabriel hadn't expected. He said that the man she'd gotten involved with, the one she'd risked everything for, was someone who was part of their lives in a way he hadn't yet realized. A man who hadn't arrived by chance. Who knew her even before Gabriel knew. And when he asked who he was, she took a while to answer. And then he said the name. The name that made Gabriel sit back on the couch as if he'd been punched. It was Marcos. An old college friend of Gabriel's. Someone with whom he'd shared parties, games, and secrets. A name he hadn't heard in years, but which still caused discomfort whenever it came up. Because there was something unresolved there. An old story of broken trust, of veiled envy and resentment disguised as smiles. Laura explained that she had met Marcos by chance, at a bar with friends. That she didn't recognize him right away, that he only revealed who he was after a few conversations. That he was kind, charming, attentive. That he made her laugh again, that he listened to her differently. And that, when she finally realized who he was, she was already too involved. She said she didn't know if he approached her with ulterior motives, if there was some underlying motivation, but that there was something about him that made her feel alive. Gabriel closed his eyes, and for an instant, the entire past came back like a whirlwind. The fights in their youth, the comparisons, Marcos's resentment at not having achieved the same career, the same prestige. It all made sense now. Laura said he never promised anything, that he left her as he had entered, and that she realized too late that she had been just part of a game that wasn't hers. Gabriel felt the pain of betrayal multiply. Not because of the physical infidelity, but because of the symbolism of it all. Because it had been him. Precisely someone who, deep down, always wanted to see him fall. Laura apologized. Not for what she felt, but for the consequences of having acted without thinking. She said she hadn't meant to hurt him that way, but now understood the damage was irreversible. She said she'd seen him move forward with dignity, that she'd learned of his new relationship through mutual acquaintances, and that she'd felt envious of something that, ironically, had once been hers. Gabriel said nothing. He simply stood up, walked to the door, opened it, and looked at her. Not with anger, but with the certainty that the chapter was closed. Laura understood the gesture. She also stood up, walked silently, and as she passed him, said, "You were everything. And I destroyed that with my own hands." He simply replied, "And now, I am everything, without you." The door closed. Outside, she left with hunched shoulders, no one waiting for her, no clear destination. Inside, he stood for a few minutes, breathing deeply, digesting the last piece of the puzzle. Now he knew everything. Now he was whole enough to begin again. And outside, unbeknownst to her, someone was watching her. Someone who saw it all from afar. Who saw the fall, the regret, the loss. And what would come next would further change the paths of everyone involved in this story. Days after their last encounter, Gabriel returned to walking the streets as if picking up the pieces of his own existence. Something in him had changed definitively. It was no longer just about overcoming a betrayal or starting a new life. It was about traversing the wreckage of everything that had been and understanding that certain wounds don't heal and disappear, they remain as marks that shape who we become. Laura had left, taking more than objects or memories, she had taken with her a part of the past that would never return. The void that remained was no longer absence, but free space. And this space began, slowly, to fill with new colors, new gestures, new presences. Life continued with its cruel naturalness, the world doesn't stop so that no one suffers, and routine, in its merciless indifference, drags even the most broken down. But between one day and the next, between the silences and the internal reconstructions, something unexpected began to take shape in Gabriel's life, something unplanned, but absolutely real. It was a Friday afternoon when he met Helena again. They had seen each other only a few times before, always at social events or casual encounters, but there was something about her that now caught his attention in a different way. She was discreet, sweet without being submissive, self-assured without being arrogant. She worked with children and had the serene weariness in her eyes of someone who cares too much for others. When they met by chance in a bookstore, they began talking naturally. It was as if the universe conspired to make that moment happen. They talked about books, about the absurdities of adult life, about pain that doesn't need to be detailed to be understood. Gabriel didn't tell his story. He didn't need to. And she didn't ask. There was a silent respect between them for others' pain, as if each recognized in the other a courageous attempt to move on. And, that same week, they arranged to meet again. An unpretentious coffee turned into a light dinner, which turned into a long walk down the nearly empty street, until, without rushing, Gabriel took her home and the night ended with a tight hug, the kind that calms without needing to promise anything. The relationship with Helena didn't begin as a replacement. It was something new, built with a different maturity. Gabriel, now more attentive to his own emotions, allowed himself to feel slowly, without giving everything away at once. She, in turn, didn't demand confessions or declarations, she offered presence, listening, and truth in every gesture. Over time, their encounters became more frequent. His apartment, previously silent and impersonal, now began to bear traces of her presence, a book forgotten on the sofa, a new mug in the kitchen, a blouse draped over the chair. But none of this suffocated him, on the contrary, it was as if every detail showed that a new chapter could, indeed, be written with dignity and calm. Gabriel still remembered everything he'd experienced with Laura, but not with bitterness. The memory existed, but it no longer hurt. It was simply a record of what once was. And as life continued on this new path, he learned from a mutual friend that Laura had temporarily moved in with her parents. That she had distanced herself from her old friends, who spent most of her days in seclusion, avoiding meetings, avoiding explaining herself. She still seemed lost, wandering among the rubble of her choices. Gabriel took no pleasure in this. Her pain wasn't fuel for his happiness. But deep inside, there was a sense of natural justice, as if balance was finally returning to where it should be. And it was just when everything seemed to be falling into place that the past decided to take another step toward the present. One random Saturday, he received an unexpected invitation. An old college friend was throwing a small celebration at her house, a reunion with people she hadn't seen in years. Helena encouraged him to go, even though she said she couldn't accompany him because of a family commitment. He went. He wanted to reconnect with some faces from the past, breathe a breath of fresh air. The house was full but quiet. The music was low. The conversations were nostalgic. Gabriel felt good, only displaced in time, as if he were visiting a younger version of himself. Until he saw Marcos. The impact wasn't immediate. The two stared at each other, recognized each other, and there was a silence between them that seemed to contain years of pent-up resentment. Marcos approached, but with a different smile, less arrogant, more cautious. They exchanged dry, almost bureaucratic greetings. And, to Gabriel's surprise, Marcos asked to talk. They spoke few words at first. Formal questions, polite answers. Until Marcos, with a strange look, heavier than the room could handle, said he needed to get something off his chest. He said he hadn't slept well since the last time he saw Laura. That he had gotten involved with her without realizing the consequences. That, at first, it was just a game. A kind of silent revenge for everything Gabriel had achieved. He admitted he approached her with the intention of proving to himself that he could still win, somehow. But he didn't expect it to turn into a trap for them both. Gabriel listened but didn't respond. He just watched, like someone analyzing a storm from afar, deciding whether it was worth getting closer. Marcos then said he tried to distance himself from Laura when he realized she was getting serious. That he realized he had crossed a line and didn't know how to go back. But above all, he needed to tell him something he'd never had the courage to say. And what he said made Gabriel's feet shift. Marcos revealed that Laura didn't meet him by chance at that bar. That she knew who he was from the start. That she was the one who started the conversation. That she was the one who made it all seem casual. That Laura, days before betraying him, had discovered an old story involving Gabriel and Marcos, an old fight, a betrayal of a friendship from their youth that she hadn't known about until then. And, upon discovering this story, something in her was reactivated. Something that perhaps even she didn't know how to deal with. According to Marcos, she sought him out as if trying to challenge the past. As if wanting to stir up old wounds in someone she loves, even if unconsciously. Gabriel stood still. It was a lot to digest. What affected him most wasn't the fact that Laura had cheated. But the fact that she had, perhaps, gotten close to Marcos not just out of need or a slip-up, but out of an unresolved emotional impulse. As if, upon discovering a hidden part of his past, she felt she didn't truly know him, and instead of asking, she chose to sabotage him. It was a double whammy. Because now he understood that her mistake hadn't been just a one-time thing. There had been choice. There had been awareness. There had been intention. Even if she herself had misunderstood it. Gabriel got up, left Marcos there, and left the party without looking back. The walk home was in absolute silence. Not because of the absence of noise, but because within him there was now a new layer of understanding. A bitter layer. But also a liberating one. That same night, he wrote a letter to Laura. He didn't send it. But he needed to get it out. He said he forgave her, not out of kindness, but out of self-love. That he regretted not what she did, but what they had lost. He hoped one day she would understand why some things cannot be undone. That she would find peace. That he had already found his. And when he finished, he burned the letter in the backyard, watching the words turn to ash in the dim moonlight. He went inside, turned out the lights, and slept like he hadn't slept in a long time. Meanwhile, across town, Laura sat in the darkness of her own room, cell phone in hand, staring at the blank screen. She knew he wouldn't write. She knew silence was the definitive answer. But still, she waited. Waited for a gesture, a sign, anything. Her conscience was now too heavy a burden. And there was no one to share it with. Friendships had drifted away. Family avoided the subject. And the man she destroyed everything for was no longer there. Only her remained. With her own mistakes. And a regret that had nowhere to run. Gabriel, for his part, moved on. He hadn't forgotten, but he had freed himself. He was ready to love again. But now, with more open eyes, clearer boundaries, and renewed faith in himself. Helena was by his side, unpressured, unhurried. And, for the first time in a long time, he felt exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because everything went right, but because he survived what went wrong. And survived whole. Gabriel began to notice something different in the way he breathed. It was as if the air entering his lungs was now lighter, less burdened by guilt, frustrated expectations, or memories that had previously weighed down like invisible anchors. After so long living amidst forced silences and veiled deceptions, he was truly beginning to exist in peace. The sensation didn't come from a specific day, nor was it celebrated with euphoria. It came slowly, like a serene understanding that certain cycles don't close with applause or tears, but with acceptance. And it was into this post-storm silence that Gabriel dove in. His days began to take on new colors, not as vibrant as the first years with Laura, but more consistent, more sincere. It was as if everything around him was reorganizing itself, respecting the limits of a new version of himself. More cautious, more attentive, more human. He was no longer surprised by the absence of certain people, he no longer sought justifications for the distance of others, because he finally understood that when the truth emerges, it not only liberates, it also redefines the contours of relationships. Helena remained present, but without imposing herself. Her way of loving was gentle, without invading spaces, still healing. Gabriel allowed himself to enjoy her presence without comparisons, without rushing, without projecting onto her what had been missing in the previous one. Sometimes they would go for a walk hand in hand without saying much, and that was enough. Other times, she would sleep in his apartment, and he would wake first, just to see her lying there, peaceful, as if this new chapter finally had a place to blossom. There were still fears of repetition, shadows of what he had lived. But beside her, these shadows didn't seem threatening. They were simply what they were, vestiges of what was left behind. His professional life was also beginning to fall into place, with Gabriel more focused, more grounded, less burdened by emotional absences. It was clear to those around him that he was rebuilding. And not just rebuilding his life, but rebuilding himself internally, with greater clarity about what was worth keeping close. Meanwhile, Laura lived on the other side of the mirror. The silence she once chose was now the only sound available. Separated from former friends, she walked streets that once belonged to her life as a couple, and now seemed empty even with people passing by. It was as if every corner carried a reflection of what she had destroyed. I was aware that there were no longer open doors, and there was no point in trying to justify it. She was finally face to face with herself, without masks, without distractions. And in that raw encounter with her own solitude, she began to understand what she had never allowed herself to see before. She began to revisit the choices she had made, not with the intention of seeking forgiveness, but to try to understand where she had lost herself. There was a shame in her that went beyond betrayal. It was the shame of having become someone she didn't recognize. Of having hurt someone who had always treated her with affection. Of having sabotaged the only story that, despite its flaws, was built on truth. And the more she delved into it, the more she realized that her pain came not just from the loss of Gabriel, but from the brutal realization that she might never be loved with that purity again. On a particularly difficult night, Laura wrote an email. It wasn't an attempt to win him back, nor a dramatic plea. It was an honest letter. She said she didn't expect a reply, nor forgiveness, but that she needed to write. She said she now understood the damage, that it had taken her years to realize that some people only pass through life once, and that once you leave them, there's no going back. She spoke calmly, without victimhood, as if she had finally accepted her own place in history. And she ended by saying she hoped he would be happy, not as a polite phrase, but as someone who knew she no longer had the right to be part of that happiness. Gabriel read the email in silence. He didn't respond. Not out of coldness, but because everything that needed to be said had already been said. Her letter was, for him, a kind of definitive ending, not the kind one writes in anger, but the kind one delivers with the tranquility of someone who has understood the value of moving forward without carrying the past. And then came the invitation to Gabriel's sister's wedding. An intimate, family event, bringing together people from different stages of life. Helena was invited as her date, and they went together, discreet but visibly connected. During the ceremony, Gabriel was moved by the vows, not out of longing, but because he understood how much love demands emotional responsibility. Promising so much is easy, but keeping what you promise is another story. After the reception, as they walked to the car, Helena held his hand more firmly. There was a new sparkle in her eyes, not of demand, but of complicity. He returned the gesture with a calm look and said he felt ready. Not to repeat what he had experienced before, but to build something new. With her. Outside the church, from a distance, Laura watched silently. Not out of a desire to disrupt, but because she wanted to see with her own eyes what she had lost. She saw Gabriel hug his sister, talk to family members, smile lightly. She saw the way he looked at Helena. Not with euphoria, but with respect. With peace. And there, in that moment, I knew he had rebuilt his life. I knew I was no longer part of any possible future for him. She returned home alone. She didn't cry. She didn't rebel. She simply accepted it. She spent the night rereading old notes, travel memories, old photos. But there was no longer sharp pain, only melancholy. A longing for what would never be again. And it was in this feeling that she finally understood the price of not knowing how to care for something true when you have it. How misunderstood freedom can become a prison. And how certain choices, even made in the name of self-discovery, can destroy the most precious thing in a relationship, trust. For Gabriel, time passed more naturally. He began renovating part of the apartment, swapping out furniture, changing colors, adapting spaces for a new routine with Helena. It wasn't a ritual of erasing the past, but of renewal. It was a symbol that he was building a new phase, based on everything he'd learned from the pain, from the fall, from the new beginning. They began cooking together, traveling little by little, exploring each other's corners with mature curiosity. And in the midst of these days, Gabriel received an unexpected call from an old friend of the group. Someone who had distanced himself in recent months, perhaps out of discomfort, perhaps because he wasn't sure how to act. He apologized for the distance, said he'd been afraid to choose sides, but now he understood. That he'd followed his journey from afar and was happy to see him well. Gabriel thanked him, said he held no grudges, that he understood how difficult it was for some people to face situations like these. And yes, he was fine. Not completely healed, because there are wounds that don't disappear, they just transform into learning, but whole enough to move on in peace. A few days later, Helena and Gabriel decided to have a small dinner with close friends. A light-hearted gathering, without any major pretensions. They laughed, told stories, and toasted to life. During dinner, in a moment of distraction, Gabriel looked around and noticed how different everything was. How different he was. And he thought that perhaps true forgiveness wasn't about excusing the other person, but about freeing oneself from the pain they caused. That a true new beginning doesn't require forgetting, but remembering without hurting oneself. And there, with the soft light of the room illuminating the smiling faces around the table, he knew that, despite everything, he had won. Far away, on a random night, Laura walked alone through the streets of a new neighborhood, trying to start over discreetly. She had a new job, few friends, and a life without much happening. But within her, now, there was a quiet awareness and a maturity she had lacked before. She had learned, too late, the value of honest love. And this learning was now her most constant companion. Time, unforgiving as it is, would move on for everyone. But what each person would carry from it would be the true reflection of the choices they had made. And Laura's choices, now, had taught her a lesson she would never forget. What Gabriel didn't know yet was that one last conversation would happen. Not because it was necessary. But because life sometimes waits for the exact moment to end cycles with the words stuck in his throat. And that moment would come when he least expected it. Gabriel hadn't expected that email to receive a response. He had already ended the story with Laura inside him. He had done so without a speech, without needing to prove he had overcome the pain. But life has a strange way of testing the firmness of decisions, and sometimes it offers not a second chance to start over, but a final opportunity to deeply understand what was left unresolved. It was late afternoon when he left work and found Laura standing across the street, near the building where he usually parked. Her presence, there, without warning, without a previous message, caused him an unease that wasn't anger or fright, it was a mixture of surprise and recognition. They hadn't seen each other in weeks, and now, as if something had pushed her there, she stood before him with her eyes lowered, her body hunched, and an expression that seemed to contain everything that had been unsaid before. Gabriel stared at her for long seconds without moving. The silence between them weighed more heavily than any argument. She was the first to speak. She didn't apologize, didn't say she missed him. She simply asked if he could listen to her for a few minutes. Gabriel hesitated, but eventually accepted, perhaps out of respect for the past, perhaps because he felt this conversation could, in fact, seal what still remained unresolved. They walked in silence to a bench in a nearby square, the same place where, years ago, they had made plans for the future. Now, the setting was the same, but everything around them carried a new weight. They sat side by side, not too close, and Laura began to speak in a tone he hadn't heard in a long time, calm, sincere, without emotional makeup. She explained that, in recent months, she had been in therapy. She began to confront old issues she had always avoided, and that she needed to return to her childhood, to her teenage memories, to the times when she learned to run away when faced with stability. She said she had an unconscious tendency to sabotage what she felt was too good, as if emotional comfort frightened her more than rejection. She revealed that she was never able to understand the extent of the security Gabriel offered until she lost it completely. She spoke of how she idealized love as something that should always come with intensity, drama, and ups and downs, and how this blinded her to the peace he represented. She said she didn't expect reconciliation, that she wasn't there to reopen doors, but that she needed to talk to him while there was still a chance of being heard. Gabriel listened attentively, but kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, not looking at her directly. Her words struck deep, not because they stirred pain, but because, in a way, they brought meaning to silences he'd never known how to interpret. When she finished, he took a deep breath and waited for an answer that didn't come immediately. Gabriel took a few seconds, then slowly turned and said that she did deserve to be heard, but that perhaps a full understanding of what had happened would never come, because some pains don't lend themselves to explanations. He said he didn't hate her, that he never had, but that he'd learned to protect his own peace, and that this protection now came first. Laura nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. She said she understood. That she now knew what it meant to lose someone inside, and that this loss was more painful than any physical separation. Gabriel said nothing more. He simply stood up and said he had to go. Laura sat alone for a few minutes, staring at her intertwined fingers. It was as if that conversation had served as the final chapter of a book she'd been silently rereading, hoping for a different ending. But the ending was already written. And now, finally, understood. As he walked back home, Gabriel felt light, not as if freeing himself from a burden, but as if finally understanding that some stories must end for others to truly begin. And the story with Helena was only just beginning. That night, he found her at home, preparing something simple for dinner. She greeted him with a calm smile, and he returned it with a lingering kiss on her forehead, as if recognizing the value of a precious gift. They sat together at the table, and Gabriel recounted his encounter with Laura, without hiding anything, but also without unnecessary details. Helena listened silently, and when he finished, she simply said she trusted him and was happy he'd been able to end this cycle with dignity. Over time, Gabriel and Helena grew deeper into each other. They shared pasts, fears, and plans. They built an intimacy based on truth, with room for failure and learning. It wasn't an idealized love. It was real. There were disagreements, adjustments, and difficult moments. But there was a solid foundation, built with maturity and affection. Gabriel now knew what he sought and what he deserved. He knew how to identify the first signs of imbalance. He knew how to listen and be heard. And most importantly, he knew that love isn't just about feeling, it's about choice, presence, and the continuous effort to keep the connection alive. Helena was different from Laura, but not because she was perfect. She was different because I was willing to walk beside him with both feet in the present, without carrying ghosts from the past or impossible dreams of an idealized future. A few months later, on a quiet Sunday, Gabriel and Helena decided to visit a small town nearby, just for the day. They walked the cobblestone streets, ate ice cream, and took pictures. They sat by a lake, and in the middle of some random conversation, Gabriel said he hadn't felt so peaceful in a long time. Helena smiled, put her head on his shoulder, and said she felt the same. There were no promises in that moment. There was no need. What was there was more valuable, the mutual recognition that they were exactly where they wanted to be. It was the kind of relationship you don't shout to the world, but live in silence, with sincere intensity. Laura, for her part, moved on with her life at a slower pace. She continued with therapy, got a new modest apartment, and gradually made new friends. She began to understand that starting over wasn't about erasing the past, but learning to live with it without letting it define who she would be from then on. She began to value silence as a space for reflection, not guilt. And little by little, without major events, she began to build a new version of herself. Not a perfect version, but a more lucid, more responsible, more aware of the consequences her choices could have. In a moment of calm, while organizing old notebooks and storing away objects she no longer needed, Laura found a forgotten photo, her and Gabriel on a long-ago trip, embraced, smiling in front of the sea. For a moment, she stared at that image. Not with pain, but with honest longing. Longing for what they were, what they built, what they destroyed. But she didn't cry. She just smiled slightly and put the photo away in a box with other mementos. She knew those days would never return, and that she shouldn't. But she had learned to look at the past with respect, not with blind regret. And perhaps, for that reason alone, she was already taking a new step. Life now no longer revolved around what she had lost, but what she could still build. Meanwhile, Gabriel and Helena returned from their short trip, talking about books, plans for the coming weekend, ideas for the future. The radio played an old song they both knew. And in that simple moment, amidst laughter and knowing glances, Gabriel was certain that love, when true, doesn't have to be perfect, it just needs to be lived with courage and truth. The past had finally found its place. And the future, still blank, seemed more promising than ever. But the story wasn't over yet. Something awaited them just ahead. One last curve in the road that would test everything they'd learned so far. Because even when everything seems peaceful, life likes to test the firmness of the roots before allowing them to fully blossom. It was a clear morning with calm winds when Helena woke first, still enveloped by the soft light that filtered through the half-open curtain. She watched Gabriel sleep, his face serene, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that conveyed peace. She touched his shoulder gently, just to be sure it was real. He opened his eyes slowly, smiled with that silent tranquility she loved so much, and without saying a word, pulled her close. That morning, like so many others in recent months, seemed ordinary. But in truth, it was the consolidation of everything he had built after his fall. That home, which once carried the shadows of a broken history, was now a living space, full of meaning, of small shared habits, of plans that blossomed without fear. Gabriel had chosen, for the first time, not just someone to love, but someone with whom he could grow without losing himself. On weekends, they cultivated a small vegetable garden on the porch. Helena, with her natural patience, taught Gabriel how to work with the earth, with the timing of the seeds, with the wait for the fruits. And he, always so rational, learned to slow down, to allow himself to be vulnerable. Their coexistence was light, without absences disguised as silence, without distance disguised as routine. It was a relationship built on the solid foundation of truth, but also on constant attention to the small details. Gabriel no longer wondered about the past, no longer compared, no longer sought answers to pains that had been healed. And that, in itself, was a miracle. One day, on a walk in the park, Helena held his hand and said there was something she wanted to share. Gabriel stopped, looked at her intently, and she took a deep breath before telling him she really wanted to build a family with him. Not immediately, but she did. She wanted to think about that future together. For the first time in a long time, Gabriel felt no fear. No doubt. No weight of a poorly sustained commitment. He felt gratitude. He felt ready. He smiled, kissed her forehead, and told her that if it were with her, he would face anything. It was more than an answer to a desire. It was a silent promise of a love that learned from pain to be whole. On the other side, Laura now lived a new reality. She was no longer the center of any story, no longer occupied the space of active memory in anyone's heart. She had moved to a more remote neighborhood, where no one knew her. She worked at a small publishing house, editing texts, revising words that weren't hers. And perhaps there was an irony in this, living surrounded by stories while her own had ended so definitively. Time had given her the lucidity she'd previously lacked, but with it also came its weight. Laura wasn't unhappy. She had learned to deal with loneliness without rebellion. But there was no longer a sparkle in her eyes. She went on with her life silently, as if refusing to repeat the same mistakes, but carrying, every day, the memory of a choice that cost her everything. Sometimes, walking alone through the streets, she would see couples laughing, exchanging simple gestures of affection, and she would feel a tightness in her chest that wasn't envy, just the memory of what she once had and let slip away. Marcos, the man behind the deepest wound, also had his fate sealed. After his brief involvement with Laura, his reputation, even among his former colleagues, was tarnished. Not by gossip, but by the realization that he had crossed an invisible line. His relationships became superficial, his presence at gatherings dwindled, and he gradually realized that his revenge game had cost him his very integrity. He tried to move on with his life in a different circle, with new people, but emptiness soon overtook him. It was an emptiness that came not from external losses, but from the bitter knowledge that, in an attempt to bring down another man, he had destroyed a woman and undone any chance of being remembered with respect. Now, he carried it in his eyes, a look that was once self-assured, now restless, disconnected from any purpose. It was the portrait of a man who won a war of his own making, but in the end, discovered he was alone on the battlefield. Time passed unhurriedly, and with it, Gabriel and Helena continued steadfastly. They bought a small house in a quiet neighborhood and gradually filled each space with life. Helena became pregnant months after that conversation in the park. The news came at a regular breakfast, amid laughter and weekend plans. Gabriel embraced her with tears in his eyes, not out of fear of the new, but out of immense gratitude for experiencing something he'd once thought would never be possible again. The birth of their son brought more than happiness, it brought redemption. Seeing the child grow, learning to smile, to walk, to babble, made Gabriel understand clearly that nothing was in vain. That everything he'd suffered, all the pain, all the silent nights, all the choices he seemed to have, were, in the end, the path to that moment. Laura learned the news months later, through a social media post from a distant friend. A simple image of Gabriel holding his son in his arms, with Helena by his side, smiling with a love that was visible even in pixels. Upon seeing that scene, she didn't cry. She simply turned off her phone and stood for long minutes, silently, staring out the window of her small apartment. That image said it all. It was the symbolic end of everything she once had, and now no longer. There would be no more attempts, no more excuses. It was, indeed, the end. And she respected it. She kept that moment within herself, as if it were the final seal of a painful learning experience. Years passed. Gabriel and Helena formed a strong family. The boy grew up surrounded by love, communication, and presence. The house was filled with noise on weekends, with scattered toys, the smell of home-cooked food. Gabriel would often watch them from the kitchen, the woman he chose and the son who united them, and silently give thanks. With each new day, he reaffirmed the commitment he made to himself, never to let the pain of the past hinder his ability to love again. He had done it. He had gone through hell without letting the fire turn him bitter. He had found love, not perfect, but whole, and that was more than he had ever dreamed. Laura, in turn, moved to another city. She began teaching literature at a public school, where she gradually discovered a new way of connecting with the world. Her classes were profound, filled with reflections on love, guilt, and forgiveness. The students, many of them marked by difficult histories, found a welcome in her words. And perhaps there, in that role as teacher and guide, Laura discovered a new opportunity to reframe her pain. She didn't forget what she experienced, she didn't try to erase her story. But she found purpose in transforming her own fall into bridges so that others wouldn't fall the same way. She was a more sober, more attentive, more human woman. She didn't rebuild her love life in the same way, but she rebuilt herself as a human being. And that, sometimes, is all one can ask for. And so, the story ends. With each following different paths, reaping the consequences of their choices. Gabriel with his heart restored and a new family born of true love. Helena as the woman who offered love without demands, who healed with presence and truth. Marcos with his conscience marked by the bitterness of his own games. And Laura, transformed by pain, but at peace with the fact that certain mistakes cannot be undone, they only teach. If you've made it this far, leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. We want to know how you felt, what touched you most, and if you've ever experienced or witnessed anything similar. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see more stories like this, with unexpected and thought-provoking endings. This story is a powerful reminder of how betrayal, no matter how small, has the power to destroy homes, loves, and futures. An act of disloyalty not only breaks the bond between two people, but also hurts everything around them: friendships, families, memories, trust. Rebuilding is possible, but it will never be the same. So, cherish love while it exists. Be loyal, be true. And remember, this channel does not support any kind of betrayal. Never. Under any circumstances. Until the next story.